start because I see there's folks rolling in, so we'll just wait 1 or 2 minutes to give people a chance to log in. Okay, it looks to be evening off with people joining in. So want to welcome everybody. Good morning. Thank you for tuning in today. I want to welcome you to this remote public workshop to discuss the proposed amendments to California's hydrofluorocarbon reduction measures regulation, also known as the California SNAP regulation. As I mentioned a minute ago, my name is Elizabeth Shealy. I'm the chief of the research division here at CARB, and my division is responsible for this update. To develop the regulatory proposals we'll discuss today, we have had several public workshops and meetings over the last 2 to 3 years and have extensively engaged with interested stakeholders, for example, industry groups, regulated industry members, environmental groups, and other government agencies. Between now and when we take this item to the board in December of 2020, we remain available upon request to discuss our proposals. I will now turn over things to Pamela Gupta, who is the manager of the F-gas reduction strategy section. Pamela?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. My name is Pamela Gupta, and I'm the manager of the section overseeing the amendments to the HFC regulation. I'd like to start by letting you know that the webinar is being recorded. For your convenience, this recording will be made available on our website shortly after today's workshop. We will start today's presentation by going over the logistics of the webinar. Next slide, please. Excuse me. I'd like to point out that just like you, all of us in the webinar team are connecting remotely from different locations. We've held practice sessions where we try to anticipate any issues. However, if we experience any technical problems during the webinar, we request you to please bear with us. We'll do our best to get it resolved quickly. Please note that we plan to go through the entire presentation before we open the floor to questions. However, you may submit written questions at any time during the presentation by using the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. The first picture on the slide shows where you can find this feature in your control panel. To help us organize our responses, we would appreciate if you include the slide number or the section of the presentation that your question pertains to. When typing in a question or comment, please include your affiliation. To keep things streamlined, we will request you to submit all your comments and questions by typing them into the question box. If any follow-up discussion is needed for any of the questions, you may raise your hand as shown in the second picture. If you do, we will unmute you and then ask you to unmute yourself to start talking. Now let's move on to the agenda. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we'll have 3 distinct sessions today. After each of the sessions, we'll have time for questions and discussions. During that time, we'll read out the written questions and comments we have received until then, and one of the members of the CARB team will respond. This will continue until it's time for the next session. If we cannot get through all of your questions and comments during the individual sessions, we'll come back to them at the end of the webinar or respond to you directly via email. Next slide, please. And here's the CARB team that's going to present today. Richie Carr, Catherine, Kenneth, and Elizabeth Briga will be the presenters for the 3 sessions today. After each session, one or more of us will be responding to your questions. I'll now turn things over to Richie to get the first session's presentation started. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. With that, we will start our first session of the day. Good morning, everyone. My name is Richie Kaur, and I will be giving you a general introduction and then discuss the proposed rules for stationary refrigeration. Most of you are familiar with this, but to remind the audience, hydrofluorocarbons or HFCs are the fastest growing greenhouse gases in the state, nationally, and globally. As HFCs continue to replace ozone depleting substances, their emissions are increasing significantly. In cognizance of this challenge, California's Senate Bill 1383 requires a 40% reduction in HFC emissions below 2013 levels by 2030. The reduction goal means that HFC emissions must be cut in half from the current levels. The pie chart on the right shows you that in 2030, nearly 90% of the projected emissions of HFCs in California are expected to be from the use as refrigerants. Of this, 74% is just from stationary refrigeration and AC sectors. To meet the SB 1383 target, we have some current HFC reduction measures in place and some additional ones that we are proposing. This slide shows the entire timeline that CARB has been working on specific HFC reduction measures being discussed today. We start in 2016 when SB 1383 was signed into law, which, as I mentioned, mandated California to reduce HFC emissions by the year 2030. This occurred at about the same time when the world was agreeing to phase down HFCs via the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. In 2017, we finalized our short-lived climate pollutant reduction strategy, or the SLCP strategy. And this document is where we first laid out our plans to limit the GWP of refrigerants used in sectors like stationary refrigeration and AC. By way of a workshop in October of 2017, we first announced the plans to adopt the GWP limits for new refrigeration and AC equipment. However, in 2017, a court ruling led to the ultimate vacatur of the US EPA SNAP rules 20 and 21, which we were counting on to help meet our targets. To stop the federal SNAP rule rollbacks from affecting California, in early 2018, CARB adopted some of the SNAP rules as part of a regulation. This was followed by the signing of Senate Bill 1013, or the California Cooling Act, which essentially adopted all of EPA's SNAP rules 20 and 21 into California law. Once that was done, we held a workshop in October of 2018 to go back to working on adopting the GWP limits for new equipment. And then over the course of 2019, we engaged extensively with our interested stakeholders via surveys, working group meetings, and several individual and group stakeholder meetings to refine our proposals and analyze the costs and benefits. Earlier this year, we submitted our economic analysis to the California Department of Finance, and it was approved. Since January of this year, we have held 2 public workshops, this being the second of those, to discuss draft regulatory text. And as I mentioned, today is the second of those workshops. After this, we will be preparing our notice package. This comprises a document called the Initial Statement of Reasons, also called the staff report. This lays out our rationale behind the regulation, summarizes the benefits and the costs, and provides details of the amendments. Additionally, the notice package also includes the regulatory language. Once the notice package is released publicly, it will be followed by a 45-day comment period, which will terminate right before our board hearing in December. If the board approves it, the earliest effective dates will be 2022 for refrigeration and 2023 for AC. Now here is an overview of the CARB HFC regulation. As I just mentioned, we initially adopted some of US EPA's SNAP rules in early 2018 to stop the federal rollbacks from affecting California. And then later that year, SB 1013 was signed. And by dint of that, we essentially adopted all of the SNAP rules 20 and 21. Earlier this year, we combined the two via an administrative process. And this regulation is now unofficially called the California SNAP regulation. We want this to be the home for all HFC-related regulations, especially for the stationary sectors. So we are now amending this to include the new proposals on refrigeration and AC. We have also added a new variance language and made some other updates. And all of these amendments will be discussed today. Now, here is the agenda for my presentation on refrigeration today. We will begin with an overview discussing the affected end uses and broadly what the rules are. We will then discuss the draft regulatory text by end use sector. Finally, we will discuss the next steps and timelines, and we will provide our contact information again at that point. As Pamela just mentioned, throughout this presentation, please type in any questions or comments you may have. After I have gone through all of my slides, we will open up the discussion and start addressing your questions. And let's begin with the overview. Now, refrigeration systems containing more than 50 pounds of refrigerant are used in the following end-use sectors. The sizes of the boxes, while not to scale, are to show you the relative contributions of these sectors to HFC emissions in California. We know this because all facilities with systems greater than 50 pounds of refrigerant are required to register with and report to CARB under the Refrigerant Management Program, or the RMP regulation. The first sector is retail food. This is the largest end-use sector using systems greater than 50 pounds in California, and the largest contributor to HFC emissions out of these three end uses. This sector mainly consists of supermarkets, grocery stores, and other retail food establishments. The next sector is industrial process refrigeration, or IPR. This encapsulates any processing or manufacturing facility for food and non-food products. Historically, this sector has used ammonia for refrigeration and continues to do so today in the large facilities. As you know, ammonia is not a greenhouse gas. But there are facilities that use HFCs and they are registered with CARB. And finally, there's cold storage, which, like IPR, those facilities have also tended to use ammonia historically, but we do have HFC users registered with us. With that background, here's an overview of the proposed rules. All new facilities using systems containing more than 50 pounds of refrigerant must use a refrigerant with a GWP, or global warming potential value, less than 150 starting January 1st, 2022. This requirement will apply to all new facilities irrespective of end use. In the existing facilities, the rules will differ by end use due to their disparate impacts on emissions, as I just discussed earlier. Now, before we proceed to discussing the draft regulatory text, here are the expected benefits of this regulatory proposal. As you know, HFCs are very potent greenhouse gases, so the benefit of this proposal is reducing those emissions. In stationary refrigeration sector for systems greater than 50 pounds, the baseline, shown in gray, includes the impact of existing regulations. By adopting the proposed rules we are discussing today, CARB expects to achieve an additional 1.5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents in reductions of annual emissions in the year 2030. The two step downs you see on the green line reflect the emissions reductions from the retail food facilities as they comply with our supermarket fleet standards, which I will be discussing a little bit later, by the years 2026 and 2030. The proposed measures here will yield even greater emissions reductions in the long term. Between 2023 and 2040, the cumulative emissions reductions are expected to be nearly 22 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents of avoided HFC emissions. This is equivalent to taking about 250,000 passenger cars off the road each year between 2022 and 2040. And with that, let's now discuss the draft regulatory text for the refrigeration rules. Here's a quick reminder. Since this is an amendment of the existing regulation, the existing SNAP rules, or SB 1013 prohibitions, are also in there and are listed in tables 1 and 2. All of the new requirements that we will be discussing now are listed in tables 3 and 4 of the text. These tables have been edited for clarity since our January version of the regulatory text. And some of those key changes and updates or clarifications are highlighted in purple throughout my subsequent slides. We will start the discussion with the proposed rules for retail food refrigeration, the first and the largest end-use sector under refrigeration by emissions. Now, all of the proposed rules for retail food refrigeration are given in Table 4, one of the new tables in the draft regulatory text. This table format is how we have outlined all of our proposed rules, so you will see this or a variation of this repeatedly today. It first states that this particular requirement will apply to refrigeration equipment in new facilities only. Then it states the general end use, which is retail food refrigeration. It goes on to say specifically that new refrigeration equipment or systems containing greater than 50 pounds of refrigerant under that sector are prohibited from using refrigerants with a GWP of 150 or greater, starting January 1st, 2022. Again, this is new facilities. Now that leads to an important question, which is, what is a new facility? Now, for the purposes of this regulation, we are defining new facilities as either one, that they're newly constructed, two, they are repurposed, meaning they were not used for refrigeration before but will be now, or three, they are an existing facility but are undergoing a major remodel. Under the definition, points 1 and 2 are the same as they were in the previous draft of the regulatory text. Point number 3 here, which deals with what a major remodel is in terms of a refrigeration system, has been edited. You will notice that this particular portion is now more descriptive and was modified with the input of supermarket companies. So now it says a replacement of 75% or more of evaporators by number and 100% replacement of compressors and condensers. In the last draft, we had defined new refrigeration system like this. We received several questions on that, and on further consideration, it seemed more clear to define a new facility like this rather than just a new refrigeration system to avoid any confusion. Another question that we have received is, what does the effective date mean for a new facility? For any system, the effective date is tied to the date of manufacture. For systems like supermarket systems, which are built up on site, the manufacture date is when the system is first charged with refrigerant and becomes operational. So broadly speaking, for a new facility, the date is when the manufacture date is when the system becomes operational. But we have added an important exception here, which is that if you have an approved building permit before the effective date, so before January 1st, 2022, then that facility would be exempt from the GWP less than 150 rule. It was brought to our notice that facilities, especially like supermarkets, start their planning process a year or two in advance. And once they have an approved building permit, all details of their refrigeration systems have been finalized, meaning there might be new supermarkets or new facilities opening up in 2022 that already have an approved building permit before 2022. In that case, that particular new facility will be exempt from the GWP less than 150 rule. This brings me to the proposed rules for existing retail food facilities. Now, there are two ways in which supermarkets and grocery stores in California can cut down their emissions by 2030. But before I get into the details of that, I want to highlight the fact that the development of these rules was built on a partnership between CARB and the refrigeration stakeholders. Over the last year, some major supermarket companies and organizations like the North American Sustainable Refrigeration Council have demonstrated a commitment to achieving our common goal of reducing climate-damaging HFC emissions. They have also demonstrated great thought leadership in suggesting creative ways of reducing the large HFC banks that exist in the retail food industry, and a spirit of collaboration whereby they have worked closely with CARB and with each other to make these compliance options implementable and enforceable. The proposed rules here are different from what CARB had originally proposed, but these are designed to result in guaranteed emissions reductions similar to CARB's original proposal. Now, the first option for existing retail food facilities is to reduce their greenhouse gas potential. For any supermarket company, this is the sum total of the potential emissions that could result if all of their systems greater than 50 pounds across their stores were leaking. Now, the goal is to cut this down by 55% below their current levels, meaning this is a relative reduction target since progress will be measured relative to each company's current baseline. The second option is to reduce the average GWP of the supermarket chain. So if we take all the systems that are greater than 50 pounds that are used by a supermarket company, we can calculate the average GWP of the company by weighting it by the type of refrigerants they use. The goal here would be for all companies to have an average GWP below 1400 by the year 2030. This is an absolute target, meaning all companies have to hit that number of below 1400, irrespective of where their weighted average GWP is today. Both of these options result in equivalent emissions reductions on a statewide level. And here are some salient features of these compliance options. These are per company targets, or supermarket fleet standards, if you will, which means that companies have the flexibility not to retrofit every single system or store. They also have the flexibility to plan their compliance over the next 8 to 10 years since they're addressing their banks. And importantly, it prepares this sector for a future HFC phase down or a virgin refrigerant sales ban, since they have already begun transitioning towards lower GWP alternatives. And finally, we at CARB have designed our SB 1013 F-gas reduction incentive program to help the industry with this transition. And we will be holding a separate workshop for the incentive program on July 28th. Now, here's what the requirements look like in the draft regulatory text. This is also part of Table 4, as I mentioned, since this is for retail food. And companies with 20 or more retail food facilities or national chains, meaning they own more than 100 stores nationwide, those companies will have a progress step in 2026. By that year, they have to attain a weighted average GWP below 2,500 or a reduction in GHGP of at least 25%. By January 1st of 2030, all retail food companies, large or small, in the state of California will be required to attain a weighted average GWP below 1,400 or a reduction in GHGP of at least 55% below their baseline levels. Now, please note a change here. In our previous drafts, we had listed 2018 as the baseline year for GHGP. We're changing that to 2019. There were several changes made in the RMP database, R3, for the 2019 reporting year that has helped us improve the quality of reported data to assist us with the implementation of this new rule. And many of the end users reporting under the RMP regulation will recall going through some of these changes recently. Please note that this does not result in a change in the compliance obligations for the companies. We will now go through some common questions that we have received for retail food one by one. First off, are systems less than 50 pounds included in GHGP calculations? Well, if the systems were smaller than 50 pounds in the baseline year, they're not included. They're not registered in RMP and not included in the calculation. However, if you have a system that's greater than 50 pounds registered in the baseline year, but as part of compliance, you convert that to a smaller system or replace it by systems smaller than 50 pounds, those are included because we want to give you the exact amount of credit for charge reduction. So for example, if there is a 200-pound system and that gets replaced by 4 40-pound systems, we need to know exactly how much charge is in all of those together so we can give you the credit for charge reduction appropriately. Next question is, will new stores get credit under the weighted average GWP program? Because as you know, new stores are required to go to GWP less than 150. Will they count towards that? The answer here is yes. This program is designed to reward the adoption of low GWP refrigerants. Now, once you open a new store, it becomes part of your fleet. And we believe that giving that extra credit for new stores will hopefully encourage retailers to try those low GWP options even in their existing stores, which was really the main barrier against CARB's original proposal. Next question. Do retailers have to choose between GHGP and weighted average GWP pathways? The answer is not anymore. In our previous draft regulatory text, we did have an opt-in requirement. We have now removed that because we want the retailers to have the flexibility to try any and all strategies for charge and GWP reduction in their stores, and then decide whatever strategy suits them best. Next question is, which rules apply to supermarket chillers? Now, if a chiller is being used in a supermarket, that is an indirect supermarket system. So the rules for retail food apply to those chillers, meaning if it's a new facility, the GWP of the refrigerant has to be less than 150. If it's an existing facility, it has to comply with the fleet standards, weighted average GWP or GHGP. Please note here that the requirements for chillers used for industrial process refrigeration are different, and I'll discuss them a little bit later. And then the next question is, which rules apply to new remote condensing units? Now, again, all systems greater than 50 pounds, whether they're remote condensing units or rack type systems or any other type of system, have to abide by the same proposed rules. So in new facilities, if the charge is greater than 50 pounds in the RCU or the remote condensing unit, the GWP has to be less than 150 for new facilities. And if it's an existing retail food facility, then again, the existing rules apply. The fleet standard rules apply. If the charge is less than 50 pounds, then existing SNAP rules continue to apply, and those are listed in Table 1. Next, we will be discussing the second refrigeration end use, which is industrial process refrigeration or IPR. As you may know, this sector uses a lot of chillers, so we will be discussing the proposed rules for chillers, non-chiller systems separately. In addition, we will also cover the rules for ice rinks. Now, here are the proposed rules for IPR. All of these are listed in Table 3. These are the rules for the chillers. The prohibition on GWP for chillers varies depending on the temperature ranges. The effective date for new chillers is January 1st, 2024. This date was already present in SB 1013 for chillers, and we're keeping that consistent. For the highest temperature range, which is the same range used for comfort cooling or air conditioning, the GWP of the refrigerant has to be below 750 effective January 1st, 2024. For lower temperature ranges used in industrial process refrigeration, the GWP limits for new chillers there are higher, and they go up to 2200. Now, these temperature ranges have been set based on input from AHRI and other industry stakeholders, depending on the feasibility in those facilities. Next, here are the requirements for the new non-chiller systems used in IPR. These are the other refrigeration systems, perhaps rack-type systems, similar to those used in supermarkets. Here, like retail food, in new facilities, if the system is greater than 50 pounds, they have to use a refrigerant with a GWP less than 150, starting January 1st, 2022. Because these are not chillers, they will have the same effective date as the other refrigeration systems, which is 2022. And these are big, large, centralized systems, so they have that same requirement of going to GWP less than 150. In existing facilities, new systems greater than 50 pounds have a GWP limit of 2200. Now, this is the first time we are regulating the IPR sector like this. As I had mentioned earlier, this sector historically has used ammonia, but the facilities that use HFCs will now be prohibited from using the very high GWP refrigerants, even in their existing facilities. Now, here are the rules for ice rinks. Ice rinks commonly use chillers and sometimes non-chiller systems. So for new ice rink systems, irrespective of what kind of system that is, the proposed GWP limit is 750, effective January 1st, 2024, which is consistent with the effective date for other chiller systems. Now, we did receive a question about IPR, which is, does the IPR definition in CARB's regulatory text match the US EPA definitions? The answer is yes, but it was a shorter definition, and we have since modified it to align it even more closely with the US EPA definition under Rules 608 and the SNAP rules. And this suggestion came to us from AHRI. The definition is now longer and is on the screen. I won't read it out, but the main reason for aligning closely with the US EPA definitions is that they are the ones who issue SNAP listings for acceptable and unacceptable refrigerants in the various end uses. For SNAP-approved refrigerants to be used in any sector in California, we have to make sure that our definitions are aligned with the US EPA's definitions of those end uses. That brings me to the third and final end-use sector for refrigeration, which is cold storage. Now, like IPR, as I had mentioned before, the new proposed rule for cold storage in a new facility is, again, that if the system is greater than 50 pounds, then the refrigerant GWP has to be below 150 starting 2022. This is listed in Table 3 of the draft text, just like IPR rules. We do want to make a clarification here that SB 1013, which, as I mentioned earlier, the California Cooling Act, already had some specific prohibitions for cold storage that will become effective in 2023. Now, those prohibitions are listed in Table 2 of the regulatory text and are already part of law in California. These prohibitions will continue to apply in all other cases, meaning, for example, if a new system greater than 50 pounds goes into an existing facility. Another very important thing to note is that the SB 1013 prohibitions for cold storage do not have a system size threshold, meaning it applies to new systems even less than 50 pounds, which is different from IPR, and something to keep in mind. And with that, now that we've gone through the proposed rules for all the refrigeration systems across the end-use sectors, we will now discuss the requirements which support robust enforcement. We will be using some standard tools like labeling and record keeping for manufacturers. And additionally, we have some reporting requirements for retail food facility owner-operators to enforce compliance with the weighted average GWP and GHGP requirements. To make things simpler, the requirements for the retail food facilities have been harmonized with those under the RMP regulation. This way, facility owners operators will just continue to report their information on CARB's online database R3 as part of the same annual report they already submit to CARB under the RMP regulation with minimal additional work. Now here's a summary slide showing all of the enforcement-related requirements. We will discuss this very briefly in the next few slides. These were all present in the January draft of the regulatory text as well and have not undergone any significant changes. Here are the labeling requirements for manufacturers. Now, right off the bat, the labeling requirement can be met by labels that manufacturers already use. For example, UL labels, if they display the type of refrigerant, the amount of refrigerant if available, because these are built-up systems, the date of manufacture in a standard format. And please note that these labeling requirements are in lieu of the disclosure statement requirement that was required for the existing SNAP regulation, which is not required now for either new Table 3 or 4. The next requirement for equipment manufacturers are record-keeping requirements. Also note that these are also similar to the original 2018 California SNAP regulation requirements, meaning you have to keep some of these records as a manufacturer, which CARB can then request records for enforcement. On to the requirements for retail food facilities. As I mentioned, the requirements for these facilities are harmonized with RMP to make reporting for these proposed rules simpler and easier. Just a reminder, under the RMP regulation, each year, every facility that uses systems greater than 50 pounds already has to submit an annual report to CARB, where they register the systems, they report the refrigerant purchase and use. Reporting is done electronically by end users into CARB's online database R3, and these requirements on the screen will just be added to those. So first off, registration. There will be a one-time registration requirement for even the new facilities that use refrigerants less than GWP of 150. This is so that we can give you credit for those new stores under the weighted average GWP program and for inventory purposes. Now remember, this is similar to the current registration, but this is a one-time registration and there is no fee. Also, if a company has any stores that are already using refrigerants with GWP less than 150 in California today, and you want credit for those stores under the program, please register those with us by January 1st, 2022. Next is the reporting requirement, which is starting 2022. As companies submit their annual reports in R3, they will be also asked to enter their weighted average GWP and GHGP values each year. Please remember that the RMP annual reports that each company already submits contains all of the data you need to calculate these numbers. You will just be asked to enter the two figures based on your calculations. And finally, for retail food facilities, please keep all of your records for the calculations you do for GHGP and weighted average GWP, meaning your spreadsheets, etc. And any changes that you make to either the refrigerant GWP or the charge of the system or both, please keep records of that as well. And this is documentation that typically retailers keep already for the changes that are done. And with that, I will now go over the next steps and the anticipated timelines. You will see this table after all 3 sessions today, just in case attendees leave early or join later. As you know, we have held a number of public workshops discussing these rules with you. After today's workshop, we will be working towards finalizing our notice package. And once the notice package is released, it will be followed by the opening of the 45-day comment period, which will open on October 23rd and end right before our board hearing, which will either be 10th or 11th of December. If our board adopts the regulation at the hearing in December, the earliest effective date for refrigeration will be January 1st, 2022. Please note that stakeholders can comment at any point in the process leading up to the board hearing, but for early comments to be considered, especially in the draft regulatory text, we request you to please submit them by August 5th. Please send all comments and questions for the draft text to hfcreduction@arb.ca.gov email address. Emails that are sent to this address go to the entire F-gas reduction strategy team. If you would like to contact any of the specific staff that work on these rules directly, here is our contact information, starting with myself and Glenn Gallagher. We are program staff, Pamela Gupta, our manager for the section, and Michael Fitzgibbon, our branch chief. You can always copy us in your emails to the HFC reduction inbox as well. And for more information on HFC reduction measures in California, please visit our website. The website address given here on the screen is also provided in the chat box of the webinar. And with that, I will thank you all for listening. As always, we welcome your feedback. We will now open the discussion on the topics that I just covered. We will try to cover as many questions as we can until 10:15, which will then take us to the next session. If there are any questions and comments pending after that, we will try to address them at the end of the webinar. And if time does not permit that, we will respond to those questions by email. Just a reminder again, if you are still typing in questions, to help us organize our responses, we would appreciate if you include the slide number or section of the presentation that your question pertains to. When typing in a question or comment, please include your affiliation. Now we will start reading out the questions we have received and answering them. Anshul, please let's start with the questions.
Thanks, Richie. Are you able to hear me all right?
Perfectly, crystal clear.
Okay. So the first question we have here is from Shannon Holbrook of EJ Gallo. When you're evaluating the impact of the refrigerants to the atmosphere, are you looking at just the direct impact from a release, or are you looking at the lifetime impact that also includes the environmental impact from the energy used over the lifetime of the refrigerant, along with the direct impact of the refrigerant to the atmosphere? Glenn, would you answer this question, please?
Thank you. Was that for me, Anshul?
Yes,
Glenn
yes,
Gallagher
Glenn.
here from CARB. We are looking at the direct greenhouse gas emissions of the refrigerant. We have done life cycle studies where CARB has included the indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the energy usage, but these regulations do not impact the energy usage. CARB, California Resources Board, works with the California Energy Commission, and they set the energy standards. So the short answer is we're looking at refrigerant emissions, and we take into account life cycle analysis so that any prohibitions against HFCs do not result in more energy being used.
Thanks, Glenn. Next, we have a comment from Robert Raymer at the California Building Industry Association regarding slide 16. To be consistent with building standards law, the effective date should trigger on projects for which the permit is submitted to the building department on or after the effective date, not on or after the date the permit is approved. See Health and Safety Code 18938.5. Thank you for that comment, Robert. We will take that into consideration. Richie, is there anything you would like to add to that?
No, Anshul, I think you covered it. And Robert, thank you for that. We will definitely take that into consideration, and we may reach out to you for more information. Thank you.
Next question from Mark Cuesta of Tetra Tech. Is this program different from compliance with the R3 program? Richie, would you like to answer that, please?
Yes, thank you, Mark. So the R3 is the online database where facility owners, operators who have systems greater than 50 pounds register their systems and report on their refrigerant purchase and use. And if systems are above a certain size threshold, they also report their leak data for their systems. So the reporting in R3 has up until now happened for the RMP regulation, which requires all these things. Now, these current proposed regulations will just require a few additional reporting things. For example, reporting of the weighted average GWP and GHGP values, as well as that one-time free registration for the new facilities that go less than GWP 150. So the database will be the same. The compliance is being done for two different regulations. One is the RMP regulation, and the next one would be these proposed regulations. But the place where an end user goes or a facility owner goes to report everything is the same, which is the R3 database. I hope that answers your question. If not, please let us know.
Next question from Philip Johnston at Daikin Applied. Can you explain the main reasons why chiller limits were revised to be based upon temperature ranges? The wording could create a loophole. Philip then explains, sorry, Richie, just a few more comments from Philip. The chiller temperature range wording will certainly lead to loopholes. New chillers designed for minimum evaporator temperature. A chiller can be designed for lower temperatures, yet be applied at the higher temperatures. I propose wording should confirm the application and use the minimum leaving fluid temperature. I'll discuss with other AHR members. Thank you for this workshop and consideration.
Thanks, Philip. Okay, great. Thank you, Philip. And we have in the past received input from stakeholders to use that language called fluid leaving evaporator temperature versus design for minimum evaporator temperature. And it'll be great to actually follow up with you. And since you are saying you'll discuss it with the AHRI, the recommendations for these AHRI chiller limits and the language did come from them. So it'll be good to circle back on that, and let's connect after the workshop to discuss this further. Thank you.
Next question from Christina Starr of the Environmental Investigation Agency. For ice rinks, it is our understanding that they're very similar to industrial refrigeration and cold storage warehouses in their historic widespread use of ammonia and increasing use of CO2 in new systems. A third of existing NHL rinks use ammonia, and more than 50% of new systems being installed in North America are using ultra-low GWP alternatives. We would urge CARB to change the GWP limit to 150 GWP for this end use consistent with the widespread use and availability of ultra-low GWP refrigerants for this application. Is this something CARB would consider updating? I'll leave that for you, Richie, to respond to.
Thank you, Christina, for your comment. We certainly appreciate it, and we are definitely aware that ammonia is increasingly used in ice rinks. The concerns we had heard primarily was sometimes when the ice rinks are located in densely populated areas, there can be issues with permitting, but absolutely yes, CARB will consider all comments we're getting today and then figure out the best way forward. Our goal is to take the industry as a whole towards the use of low and ultra low GWP refrigerants as quickly and feasibly as possible. So we will consider this. Thank you. And we will discuss this with other stakeholders who might be interested in chiming in as well.
A question from Christian Williams. I'm not sure of their affiliation. Would the CARB group be prepared to look at funding areas where instead of looking at reductions to HFC, but also potentially engineering a solution to ensure a cooling unit could not emit any HFC emissions, which could be seen as the ultimate end goal? You could engineer the removal of this issue and have a huge emission reduction on the back of it. Thank you for that comment, Christian. We are not considering funding proposals at this point, and I will also pass on the question to Glenn Gallagher to respond to the issue of looking at HFC emissions, ensuring that HFC emissions are accounted for.
Yes, thank you, Anchal. CARB has considered many aspects of reducing refrigerant emissions. And of course, one of them might be to require that all refrigeration and air conditioning equipment is virtually leak-free. However, we know that's simply not possible to build a 100% leak-free system for anything less than, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the other thing is nobody builds a system to leak. We consider all of these leaks to be incidental or accidental. And it's really beyond, I guess, the realm of CARB to mandate as a very specific equipment design. We leave that to the manufacturers to design equipment that is as leak-free as possible, and we know they're doing their best, but leaks accidentally happen. And the other part is your point is well taken, that if the refrigerant never leaves the equipment, there is not a greenhouse gas emission problem, but we view leaks as accidental and not intentional. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Glenn. Next question, this one for you, Richie, from Helen Walter Chernoni of AHRI. Would it be possible for you to review the labeling requirements again?
Absolutely. And what I can do is I can go back to that slide really quickly. And all right. So hopefully people are seeing that slide again, which says labeling requirements for equipment manufacturers. So as I had mentioned, a label that displays essentially the type of refrigerant and the amount of refrigerant wherever available. We do understand that for these built-up refrigeration systems, such as those that are used in supermarkets, the manufacturer doesn't always know exactly how much refrigerant would go in there, but we believe there are data plates that end users can write the amount of refrigerant on. So if there's a data plate like that on there where the refrigerant amount can go in, and the date of manufacture, really if there's a standard format where the year of manufacture is on it, that would suffice. And also, if there are labels that are already on these types of equipments that already meet these requirements, such as UL labels, that would be sufficient. And I just want to reiterate that for the existing SNAP rules, there's the disclosure statement requirement, and this labeling requirement is actually in lieu of that, so that disclosure won't be required.
And this is Elizabeth. I wanted to just make a clarification on the last response. I want to clarify that it's not necessarily outside of our mandate to have requirements outside that are very specific technology-wise, but we do prefer to look at flexible options to meet things like performance standards where we can.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Helen, if you need further clarification on this, we can talk more, or feel free to ask more questions. Thanks, Anshul.
Thanks, Richie. The next question from Michael Gary of Shekel. If any federal legislation regulating HFCs is passed, how will that impact the California HFC rules? I'll direct this question to Shannon Dilly, who's from our legal team.
Anshul, could you please repeat that? My apologies.
Yes. If any federal legislation regulating HFCs is passed, how will that impact the California HFC rules?
Well, I mean, I think it would depend on what the federal legislation says as to whether or not it would impact California's rules. We have separate authority. So, you know, I think right now, what is proposed in S 2754, you know, that works well with our regulation as written currently. So I don't think that would impact our regulation as written.
Thanks, Shannon. Next question from Dave Kucho. I'm sorry, I don't think I pronounced your name correctly. The GWP not related to new plants is really good, but with millions and millions of pounds of installed capacity, with the GWP at around 3,500 or so, what will be done with this growing liability? If reclamation is the solution, reclaimed into what product? What is the plan for life cycle of installed refrigerants? Affiliation, reclaimer, refrigerant maker, carbon credit developer. Glenn, would you like to start? Give a shot
I'll
at responding
start,
to this question?
and then I'll defer to other CARB staff. Yes, CARB has been working closely with refrigerant reclaimers, and really since about 2005, when our AB 32 Global Warming Solutions Act started, CARB has looked into reclamation efforts. We realize the installed base of refrigerants represents a huge greenhouse gas potential. I guess I can't say anything definite right now, but we are definitely looking into either requiring reclaimed refrigerant or perhaps banning new refrigerant that's very high GWP. And now I will defer more explanation to Pamela or another CARB staff.
Yeah, I think Glenn, you covered it mostly. I was going to say that, of course, we have very ambitious targets. California has under SB 1383, and so multiple strategies are needed to get to those targets. So We started with the new equipment so that we don't lock in these high global warming refrigerants for the next 15, 20 years. But as Glenn pointed out, going forward, we are looking into additional strategies that will maybe needed to meet the targets by 2030. So an HFC phase down, which is something that is still in discussions, but any phase downs then help with the reclaim demand as the supply of virgin refrigerant gets reduced. So good point and something we are looking into. Thanks.
Thanks, Pamela and Glenn. Next question from Michael Gary of Shaco. In self-contained display cases in store, is the refrigerant charge calculated by individual case or total charge for store, including all cases? Richie, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Thanks, Michael, for the question. So I think straight off the bat, I'm assuming display cases, when they're self-contained, have refrigerant amounts that are much, much less than 50 pounds. So in that sense, they wouldn't necessarily be regulated, but yes, for those, for example, if an existing store were moving away from a centralized system and they were moving to several self-contained display cases, and that's what the replacement was, that they switched out a rack and just went to display cases, then we would just add up all of those. And they can tell us, we will set up the R3 database in a way that they tell us, okay, here was the original charge of the system that was serving this cooling load, and that has now been replaced by this amount of charge spread over these many systems. So the answer is both. We would like to know how many they're spread over and what the total is, if that helps. But for a new store, obviously, if the system's less than 50 pounds, they don't have to report that. They can give us the total charge of the store also and just indicate that this is all in self-contained display cases.
Thanks, Richie. Next question. This one is from Steve Heidenreich at Johnson Controls. The 150 GWP limit for cold storage and process is much too aggressive a timetable for the available refrigerants. Has the available use of 150 GWP been reviewed, as there are no refrigerants that do not have energy, water usage, safety penalties as of today? Richie, would you like to respond to that?
Sure, Anshul. Steve, thank you for the question. Your point that 150 GWP is much too aggressive, well, based on our historic understanding of these two sectors, specifically cold storage and industrial process, they already use a lot of ammonia. Most of the large facilities, based on our understanding, use ammonia, which is not a greenhouse gas, so it doesn't even have a GWP value. CO2 is making great strides in becoming an industrial refrigerant, and the combination of the two, there are several innovations. There's low charge ammonia systems, there's ammonia cascade systems that are all being evaluated. We, based on our understanding, think there are options less than 150 for both of these sectors, and we think that we need a policy driver to make the market adoption of these more sustainable options increase in these sectors. If you have more to contribute to this conversation, or if you want to give us more information, please feel free to do so, but thank you.
Thanks, Richie. Next question from Ron Shebeck at Hussman Corporation. Does CARB acknowledge an OEM is limited in its ability to track all product installation locations? Once sold, the retailer or distributor may have flexibility to install at a location which was not the original intent. Equipment may be repurposed and moved to different store sites. Richie, I'll direct that to you.
I'll start off and then I will hope that Glenn will chime in. Ron, thank you for your question. We do have requirements both on equipment manufacturers and the end users who will be using this equipment. And we have the database R3 where somebody would register it. Based on our understanding, yes, we recognize that equipment manufacturers can't always track it, but at the very least, you have to have the labels, the records, of who you sold it to, so that if CARB needs to come in for enforcement purposes and request those records, we can get those records from you. And at the same time, we have the reporting from the end users, which tells us what type of system goes into their facility. And as part of registering any system, an end user does tell us who the manufacturer of that system is. So we have both ends of this covered with our reporting requirements and record keeping and labeling requirements. Glenn, did you have anything to add
Yeah,
to that?
thank you, Richie. I believe that covered it. In the case of manufacturers sending equipment out that may or may not be compliant with the California laws, some of the responsibility also goes to the end user, who must comply with the HFC prohibitions. So as Richie described, especially with the RMP reporting, we will know if people are using equipment that's not in compliance. And yes, the regulations apply to the manufacturers, the distributors, and the end users, all equally.
Thanks, Glenn. Steve Heidenreich of Johnson Controls has his hand raised and may want to respond to your response to his question, Richie. So I'm going to unmute you, Steve, and you will probably get a message asking you to unmute yourself. Steve, are you able to speak?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Steve.
Hello. Great. Okay. Yeah, my concern is that 150 GWP, that's very low for any refrigerant for industrial refrigeration. And the viable alternatives that were mentioned was CO2. And, you know, there's certainly ammonia, but ammonia is prohibited. I mean, there's no law, as far as I understand, in California that makes it illegal, but good luck trying to get ammonia into these even small towns that have, you know, residential, or the fire department a lot of times will flag ammonia. So what you're left with is basically possibly propane, which we know is not viable either. Anything, I mean, that's very flammable and explosive, and CO2. And, you know, CO2 is an interesting, refrigerant. We've used that for a long time. Frick's been around a long time. But there's a lot of safety issues with CO2, the pressures. In these supermarkets that are going to CO2, has anybody looked at the water usage? Because in order to keep the transcritical pressures down, I mean, the pressures on CO2 could, you know, easily surpass 1,400, 1,600 PSI. You need water. And I know California, I mean, I do probably 90% of what I sell and manage in California is ammonia. So, I mean, I love ammonia, but we use a lot of water with that. So we're trying to offload, and, you know, California had their drought, and, you know, they're out of that now, which is, you know, great. But you're going to see, I think, the cost of water go up if you start using CO2, and maybe, you know, the other refrigerants, you don't require as much water to lower the pressures and whatnot. So you got water, you're definitely going to pay a penalty. I'm not sure where the numbers are coming in, but getting away from some of these refrigerants, inherently they're going to be more money for energy costs. You have the high pressures of CO2. So I just think, I mean, we can get around the other temperatures with these chillers and whatnot. Now, I mean, going to a chiller instead of a direct refrigerant in an evaporator, you're going to pay a penalty. It's an energy penalty, around 10%. So you're going to pay more money, but we can get around that. My biggest concern is the 150 GWP and trying to find a refrigerant that's viable in facilities that are 0 degree, -10, -20, and process facilities. Because I think what we're seeing in our industry.
Steve, I'm going to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Steve. This is Pamela. Thank you for your comment. Just want you to know, since we have very time restrictions, we'll take in your comment and maybe we can have more discussion offline. And going forward, I would encourage everybody to just type in their question or comment in the chat box, because we just don't have the bandwidth to have everybody talk. So unfortunately. But we will
Okay.
definitely
Yeah,
closely look at your comments. So thank you for your comment. Like to
right.
move on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just the question is, have we looked at other alternatives,
Thank you.
refrigerants
Thanks,
besides
Steve.
CO2 and propane, because those aren't the answers. Thank you.
Next question from Randy Young with the Sheet Metal Workers, Local 104. Will this all be self-reported? Will there be any audits or verifications required for compliance? Richie or Glenn, I will leave that question for you to respond to.
I can go first. Thanks, Anchal. Thank you, Randy, for your question. So on the facility users, all of that data is already self-reported. So all of the facilities that use systems greater than 50 pounds report into R3. We do routine audits. We ask for records. We always have ways of verification. We do site visits. There's a number of tools we use for compliance and checking compliance. On the manufacturer side, also, we do request records, we do go check labels on site. So while yes, the reporting requirement is for the entities to report, and I'm assuming when you say self-reported, it's the end users, facility owners, but CARB does go out and request records and do site visits, checking for compliance. Glenn, anything to add to that?
Nothing to add. Thank you, Richie.
Thanks, Anchal.
Next question from Glenn Barrett. Regarding supermarket refrigeration application, if one rack and associated cases with 25% of the total store load is replaced, would the GWP of the refrigerant used on the new rack be required to be under 150, assuming the existing rack refrigerant to be 404A? Richie, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Glenn, thank you for your question. So goes back to our definition of new facility. So here you have an existing facility. Your example, if I'm reading this correctly, says one of the racks is replaced, and that's 25% of the store load. If that roughly corresponds to just 25% of the evaporators, then, and obviously it's not 100% of the compressors, condensers, so this doesn't qualify as a full remodel or a major remodel, which means you don't have to go under 150. However, because this is an existing facility and you're required to comply with the weighted average GWP and GHGP targets, if a retailer does want to take their store partially to below 150, do it piecemeal instead of the whole store going at once, if that's feasible for them and they want to do it, that's great, because it does lower your average GWP by that amount. Because now, if 25% of it's gone under 150, that proportionally brings your average GWP for the store down. So while it's not required, it's a great option for an existing facility should they find it feasible and should they be interested in doing that. This kind of step-by-step approach towards going to less than 150 in existing stores.
Thanks, Richie. Next question from Charlotte Nesbitt. Industrial chillers, which are existing units and utilize HFC 134 with a GWP of 1000, this rule wouldn't apply since it's less than 1500. Richie, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Charlotte, thank you. First off, a clarification for everyone. When we use GWP values, we are using the IPCC's fourth assessment report, and the GWP for 134A under that is about 1430. But you are correct. First of all, the rules are for new chillers. And if it meets that minimum evaporator temperature, then since it's under 1500, that should be fine for that temperature range. But if it's a high temperature chiller, the same kind of chiller that operates in the temperature ranges for comfort cooling, then the GWP limit there is 750. So you would have to switch to alternatives like 513A, for instance, which are replacements for 134A and have GWP values under 750. So it depends what type of chiller it is, what the minimum evaporator temperature is, and we've just taken comments that we should probably look at rewording that. And also, this is new chillers only. Thanks, Anchal.
Thanks, Richie. Another question from Charlotte Nesbitt. does this apply to comfort cooling? I'm
Yes.
assuming Charlotte. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Richie.
So Charlotte, that highest temperature range that we showed does cover comfort cooling. And let me remind everybody that SB 1013 originally did have this chiller prohibitions listed. And we have now simply put a GWP limit because going forward, we would like to talk in terms of GWP and try to bring that number as low as possible for all the sectors where it's possible. So that 750 GWP limit does apply to comfort cooling chillers as well.
Thanks, Richie. Next is a comment from Kristen Tadano at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. Thank you, CARB, for your excellent work to coordinate with CPUC and utility energy efficiency programs to have greater incentives that incorporate low GWP incentives into their efficiency programs and portfolios. We hope to see more of that, particularly around supermarket refrigeration in the future. Thank you for that comment, Kristen, and we hope to see that as well. Next question from Leah Wan. Weighed in is not currently included as a method to determine the full charge. Will this method be allowed by CARB? It is the most accurate determination method for the built-up field charge systems. I will direct this question to Glenn or Richie to respond to.
Okay, Glenn here. Yes, thank you for that comment. CARB does not exclude weighing or measuring the amount of refrigerant added to a system to determine the full charge, but we are looking into clarifying our definition in the proposed regulation to add that as an option to make it extremely clear that that is definitely allowable. Anything to add, Richie?
Glenn, thank you. Leah, I will just echo what Glenn said. The intention is not to exclude it, but we do recognize it's more explicitly stated in the EPA definitions, and we are considering modifying ours so that it aligns more closely, and we explicitly state that. Thank you.
Next question, also from Leah Wan. For the baseline GHGP, with the potential for this value to change over the course of the year, example, companies may have purchased, sold, closed, or remodeled stores throughout the year. Is there a certain point in time that companies should use during 2019 to determine their baseline? Example, January 1st, 2019 or December 31st, 2019. Richie, would you like to answer that?
Yes, Leah, thank you. It's a great question. And I think we discussed this on email also, but yes, December 31st is where we're thinking at the end of that year, whatever changes have happened to the stores or the systems have happened. And at that point, you want to determine that company's baseline GHGP. The companies also submit their annual reports to us by the March of the following year. So anything that has happened between January 1st to December 31st, they report to us. They reported to us by March of 2020. So we have all of that there. Presumably it includes everything that has happened over the course of that year. So anything that has happened in terms of closing stores, selling, remodeling, transferring, that'll all be reflected in that annual report. So it's really the end of the year.
Thanks, Richie. I know we're nearing the end of our Q&A session. Maybe we'll respond to one more question and then defer to the remaining questions at the end of all three presentations. This question is from Aaron Byers from OK Manufacturing. Are there any other end-use sectors that CARB is considering looking at HFC regulations in the near future? Kamala, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks, Anshul. Thanks for the question, Aaron. Currently, as you know, or may not know, I don't know, but the HFC regulations that we already have adopted and proposed cover a wide range of end-use sectors. And we continuously look at all the end-use sectors that are using HFCs. And as I had mentioned before, we We have targets, and we continue to look at all the HFC emission sources out there. So I don't know if you had any particular end use sector you were asking about this, but even right now, most of the end use sectors that use HFCs are already under our regulations. And the question is, do we get more stringent? And that's yet to be determined. So we continue to look at what's out there and how we can reduce. Thanks for the question. And I think we just hit 10:15. So Anshul, back to you.
Okay. Thanks, Pamela. We do have a number of other questions. Like I said, we'll address them at the end, but we'll move on to the AC portion of today's presentation next.
Good morning. Thank you, Anshul. My name is Catherine Kynette, and I'm presenting on CARB's proposal to limit the use of high global warming potential refrigerants used in new stationary air conditioners. I'd like to start off today by highlighting where we are in the agenda. So the previous session covered background information on CARB's HFC regulation, why we are amending it, and CARB's proposal for refrigeration systems. The purpose of this presentation is to discuss the sections of draft regulatory text which pertain to air conditioning equipment. The next session will focus on other changes in the draft regulatory text, followed by concluding remarks. During this presentation, I'll briefly cover background on CARB's proposal for AC before spending the majority of the presentation on the draft regulatory text. We first shared the draft regulation during our last workshop back in January. The stakeholder feedback we received led us to make a few changes, namely to the definition of new AC equipment, which I'll go over. I'll also go over sections which remain the same. Then I'll go over the next steps and anticipated timelines. Finally, I'll open up the floor for your questions and comments. So first, background on the development of the AC proposal. Staff showed a similar timeline in the previous presentation, but this slide focuses on the AC proposal specifically. While we could have started this timeline earlier, I'm starting with 2016 as it was a landmark year with the passage of SB 1383, the legislative mandate which requires CARB to reduce HFC emissions 40% below 2013 levels by 2030. 2016 is also the year the world agreed to phase down HFCs under the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. The US signed the agreement but has not yet ratified it. However, the world's moving ahead and transitioning away from high GWP refrigerants, including transforming the AC market to use more climate-friendly refrigerants. In 2017, CARB finalized the Short-Lived Climate Pollutant, or SLCP, strategy. This document describes CARB's strategy for meeting the SB 1383 goal and includes setting a 750 GWP limit for new air conditioning equipment. At a public workshop in 2017, CARB announced a two-step plan to first backstop key federal prohibitions California is relying on before moving forward with the GWP limits proposed in the SLCP strategy for new equipment. CARB completed the backstopping the federal Significant New Alternatives Policy, or SNAP, prohibitions in 2018 via a new HFC regulation and through legislation SB 1013. This is the regulation CARB is amending to include a GWP limit for new AC equipment. In the fall of 2018, the Global Climate Action Summit was held in San Francisco. During this event, industry and NRDC came together requesting that CARB establish a 750 GWP limit effective 2023. Our team immediately went to work, and since 2018, we've had 5 workshops and completed our economic analysis for this regulation. Our team is currently preparing for a December board hearing, and a 45-day public comment is expected to begin in October. There are 2 other items to note on this timeline. First, the new US EPA rule that's being proposed, and second, the State Fire Marshal work group that's being convened. This year, the US EPA proposed Rule 23, which would approve a number of lower GWP A2L refrigerants for residential and commercial AC products. A2Ls are a class of lower GWP refrigerants. And use of A2L refrigerants as a compliance option for this regulation would also require changes to the California Building Code. In California, the State Fire Marshal has authority over the building codes. In 2020, the State Fire Marshal kicked off a work group to consider incorporating updated standards into the triennial California Building Code update, which would allow for the use of A2L refrigerants in time for CARB's effective date. By the time CARB holds the board hearing in December, the outcome of the State Fire Marshal work group and Rule 23 are anticipated to be known. Next slide, please. This graph shows the refrigerants being phased out for the AC industry, as well as potential refrigerant alternatives. The first bar on the left is R22, a refrigerant which is no longer allowed in new ACs because it harms the ozone layer. The majority of AC systems sold today use R410A, a refrigerant you can see here has a very high GWP value of 2088. CARB is proposing a GWP limit of 750 that would ban this refrigerant in new AC systems because of its impact on climate. Potential refrigerant alternatives for this sector have been identified based on criteria such as refrigerant properties, energy efficiency, cost, safety, and environmental impact. So the refrigerants in blue on the right are the refrigerants under 750 GWP that could be used to comply. The first 6 refrigerants in blue starting on the left are A2L refrigerants, which I mentioned before, meaning this classification means that it's possible for them to ignite under specific test conditions. The first of these on the left, R32, is an A2L refrigerant used in millions of ACs all over the world today. And it's also a component of R410A, which is a blend. The next 5 refrigerants are newer refrigerant blends, which have either similar properties to R410A or similar to R22. The US EPA has approved some A2L refrigerants for use in small equipment. For example, you could go out and buy a window AC or a portable AC with an A2L refrigerant under 750 GWP today in California. What the US EPA is now proposing is to list these refrigerants for larger residential and commercial equipment. Using these refrigerants in California does also require updates to the California Building Code, as I mentioned before, which is under consideration by the State Fire Marshal. The refrigerant furthest to the right, R466A, is a compliance option, which is an A1 refrigerant, meaning it's non-toxic, non-flammable, and no changes to the California Building Code would be needed to use this refrigerant. Industry has a range of options which present different trade-offs, and CARB set a 750 GWP limit in order to allow industry to select the option which works best for them. Next slide. CARB has received a number of questions from stakeholders about the codes and standards updates that would allow for A2L refrigerants to be used as a compliance option for this regulation. There are safety standards which would need to be incorporated into the California Building Code for A2Ls to be allowed for use. So this is a simplified flowchart showing how various standards feed into the California Building Code and which ones are kind of green, good to go, yellow in progress, or kind of blue, a next step. So the first is ASHRAE 34, which is a standard that assigns safety classifications to refrigerants based on toxicity and flammability. Many of the newer lower GWP refrigerants for R410A are classified as A2L, which stands for low toxicity and lower flammability. ASHRAE standards 15 and UL 60335-2-40 govern the installation of systems and the equipment design respectively. Both UL 2-40 edition 3 and ASHRAE 15 were recently finalized to allow the use of A2Ls. And typically the next step is for national code bodies to incorporate new safety standards into model codes, and those model codes are then folded into the California Building Code. However, the timing of the completion of the standards was not ideal for the model code cycle. However, some state agencies do have authority to propose code changes to the California Building Code directly, and there is precedent for this. In this case, the state agency with authority to make code change proposals is the State Fire Marshal. Currently, the State Fire Marshal is convening an A2L work group and is expected to make a recommendation in December to the California Building Standards Commission. At this time, manufacturers would know what code changes are being recommended regarding A2Ls. The next step for the building code would be with the California Building Standards Commission, or CBSC, and they are the entity that's tasked with administering California's code adoption process. CBSC publishes the building code in early 2022, and it's effective across all of California in January 2023. As mentioned before, for any refrigerant to be used in the United States, the US EPA must also list that refrigerant as acceptable the end use it is acceptable for, along with any use restrictions. In the US EPA's evaluation, they consider risk to human health and the environment, and a number of A2Ls are already SNAP approved for small room ACs. A new rule I mentioned before, Rule 23, has been proposed to allow a number of A2L refrigerants for residential and commercial ACs. All right, next slide. So now on to the regulatory text. This is a section of Table 3 which pertains to AC equipment. This is the standard format for all the prohibitions in the regulation. So first you're going to see the general end use, which is air conditioning equipment, followed by the specific end use, which is new air conditioning equipment. The prohibited substance is refrigerants with a GWP of 750 or greater, and the effective date is January 1st, 2023. Effectively, what this table says is that all new stationary AC systems are prohibited from using a refrigerant with a GWP of 750 or greater beginning January 1st, 2023. This language in the regulatory text clarifies what activities are prohibited and by who. The prohibition states that no person shall sell, lease, rent, install, use, or enter into commerce in the state of California any end use, in this case, new air conditioning equipment that does not comply with the 750 limit. Next slide. I would encourage you to look in the definition section for the full definition of air conditioning equipment, but here's a summary in this slide. CARB defines air conditioning equipment very broadly to mean equipment that cools or dehumidifies spaces. And examples of these product categories include room ACs, such as window, wall, and portable units, as well as the packaged terminal units found in hotels. Central ACs, also known as unitary AC. This includes air conditioners which use ducts to blow cold air, or non-ducted systems which pipe refrigerant to each room. This also includes ACs that use a refrigerant to provide heating in addition to cooling, and those are referred to as heat pumps. For the purpose of this rulemaking, the term AC also includes dehumidifiers. Computer room and data centers cooling is also included. This last category was included after our last workshop. We received stakeholder comment to include remote condensing units used specifically for AC, and these systems are different than those used in refrigeration. In the regulatory text, you'll also see that mobile AC is excluded. So if an AC is part of a vehicle, a train, or a boat, for example, it's not included in this regulation. And again, I'd like to note that chillers are defined separately. Okay, now on to the definition of new air conditioning equipment. So the GWP limit applies only to new air conditioning equipment. So what is CARB defining as new? This is relatively straightforward in the case where an AC is being installed for the first time, which is what the first part of this definition refers to. First, some ACs, such as package units, have all the components within that unit, and in that case, it's relatively straightforward. If the whole unit needs to be replaced, the new unit that replaces it must meet the 750 GWP limit. On the next slide, I'll show you what this definition means for ACs, which are split into an outdoor and an indoor unit. This picture shows a residential split system. The AC components are split into an outdoor unit and an indoor unit, which are connected via a refrigerant line. So end users can continue to repair components within their existing systems. They could even replace the indoor unit. However, once they go to replace the unit which houses the condenser compressor, the outdoor unit in this example, the new equipment that is installed must use a refrigerant less than 750 GWP. The logic for this is that the unit that houses the condenser compressor is essentially the heart of the system with the majority of the cost. And typically you're going to want to replace both the outdoor and indoor units together for energy efficiency purposes. Now on to the requirements which support robust enforcement. CARB has a standard suite of tools which are used to enforce regulations. However, it's also helpful to add requirements which are tailored to the regulation. And for this regulation, the two main tools we're adding are labeling and record keeping for equipment manufacturers. The labeling requirement can be met by labels that manufacturers already use if they display the type and amount of refrigerant and the date of manufacture in a standard format, such as in the label shown on the right. As mentioned, the second tool is record keeping for manufacturers. The type of information that would be required includes contact information for the purchaser, identifying information for the equipment, the date of manufacture, the date of sales, as well as the refrigerant type and amount. CARB would be able to request these records to assist with compliance tracking or enforcement action. Next slide. Before we proceed to next steps, here are the expected emissions benefit of this regulatory proposal. The benefit of this proposal is avoided emissions of HFCs, which are potent greenhouse gases. By enacting a 750 GWP limit for new stationary ACs effective in 2023, CARB achieves 2.3 million metric tons in CO2 equivalents of reductions in annual emissions in 2030. This is nearly 25% of the progress needed to achieve the SB 1383 target for 2030. Between 2023 and 2040, the cumulative emissions reductions are even greater at 50 million metric tons in CO2 equivalents of avoided HFC emissions. This is equivalent to taking about 500,000 passenger cars off the road each year from 2023 to 2040. And now next steps. Here are the next steps and anticipated timeline for the AC regulation. This shows the public workshops we had hosted so far, the 45-day notice package, which includes the regulatory text and the staff report, will be released in October, and that will kick off the formal 45-day public comment period leading up to the board hearing in December. There would be 3 years between the board hearing and the effective date for the 750 GWP limit. Stakeholders can comment at any point at this process leading up to the board hearing, but for early comments to be considered on the draft regulatory text ahead of staff finalizing their notice package, please submit your comments by August 5th. The email address listed here is our HFC reduction at arb.ca.gov address. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening and engaging with us on this important topic. I'm going to switch gears to the question and comment section of the webinar and also provide you with additional contact information for the AC proposal. Here is the contact information for the AC proposal, and I think we'll leave this slide up while we go to the Q&A.
Thanks, Catherine. I will read out the questions received for this portion of the presentation. I'll start with a comment from Robert Raymer from the California Building Industry Association. Actually, both HCD and the State Fire Marshal have authority over this portion of the California Mechanical Code. Any amendments will need to be jointly adopted by both agencies, a very common occurrence. Thank you for that clarification, Robert. Another question by, by Robert. IAPMO's UMC currently prohibits the use of A2L in residential AC units. While IAPMO is working on updating the standard, is ARB asking the State Fire Marshal and HCD to adopt a residential use of A2L that is currently prohibited by IAPMO's UMC? I can respond to that question, Robert. So to clarify, CARB is setting a GWP limit. We do not mandate the use of any specific refrigerant. A2Ls are one of the compliance options to meet the 750 GWP limit that we're setting. We're also not a safety agency. We are only supporting by participating in the State Fire Marshal's process. The State Fire Marshal has the statutory authority to bypass IAPMO's model code process and adopt building codes in California that are different from the national code bodies. And the State Fire Marshal is exploring the potential of doing that. So we're not requiring any specific refrigerant for use in California. Another question from Robert Raymer, would this apply to existing AC units which undergo significant repair rehab? And I will direct this question to Catherine. Before you respond, Catherine, I want to add something to Robert's question. Actually, A2Ls are permitted for use in small, hermetically sealed residential units in California already. And go ahead, Catherine.
Thank you, Anshul, and thank you for the question. So repairs are allowed. So this regulation is really not meant to affect existing equipment, except in the case where you're really going to replace a substantial part of the system. So thank you for that question. And, I'd encourage you to go back and look at the definition too. Hopefully that makes it clear. So we put the prohibition on, the exterior condensing unit or remote condensing unit. So if you're really replacing the majority of the system, at that point in time, it's a new unit. And also happy to clarify if you have any additional questions about that.
Thanks, Catherine. We have a comment from Kristen Tadano of the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. CARB has been sending clear signals since 2016 that this sector would need to switch to low GWP alternatives. That provided nearly 7 years for industry to prepare. Industry and environmental groups came together agreeing on the timeframe. Fire codes can be updated with sufficient time per your work with the fire marshal. Further delay at this point in time seems as if it would penalize responsible companies that invested in and prepared for alternatives to the benefit of those that delayed. IGST supports CARB's existing timeline. Thank you. Thank you for that comment, Kristen. Next on, I will
And this is Elizabeth. I just wanted to add on to that we appreciate that comment and the recognition that we have been working on this with stakeholders since 2016. And we are moving forward with this regulation. Really appreciate that comment. I do want to open to Helen from AHRI to give an update on the related topic. As you mentioned, the fire marshal work and the fire codes. She has an update on, I believe, on the testing that is going on. So we encourage people to really use the question box. But since we have an update, we will allow a couple of minutes for Helen to provide that. Anshul, can you unmute her?
Yes, I will. I am unmuting you, Helen. You should get a message and you need to unmute yourself now.
Thank you very much, Anshul and Elizabeth. I just wanted to provide a little bit of an update and also to make a proposal. I think that the CARB staff and industry, other stakeholders have all been working very hard to try to move forward the safety standard adoption into the building codes, as well as to work toward preparation for this transition. I think it was a heavy lift when the proposal was made in 2018 from industry to delay from 2021 to 2023. And I think now with the pandemic, I think we're facing another uphill battle. And so we will be asking for additional time here shortly. But let me first talk about the work for the fire service with UL. Yes, UL is doing a demonstration project for us, for the fire service, to develop some training for them. And we are working diligently to try to finalize that contract this week so that they can start their work in August with task 1 and move that forward as quickly as they possibly can as an input into the CAL FIRE process, where they will be continuing to evaluate the safety standards and the building codes and the next steps there. We think that it's really important for that process to move forward as scheduled. However, we are requesting that CARB consider some additional time, and we're proposing that to make up for that CARB consider a January 1st, 2025 transition date for 750 GWP for newly manufactured AC equipment, air conditioning equipment. Understanding that the safety standards in the California codes, of course, need to be aligned, and hopefully that will be done as quickly as possible, that we can do that safely. But the proposal to kind of compensate for this is to prohibit the sale, resale, transfer, and/or import for use in California of newly produced R410A, except for export from California at that time. And then to require the collection of all refrigerants at end of life, that reclaimed refrigerant meet purity standards of AHRI 700, and allow nationally reclaimed R410A to be used in California. And the equipment manufacturers will promote and encourage the recovery of R410A through education of their service and dealer networks right away. And so that's the proposal.
Helen, yep. I appreciate that. We are trying to limit the speaking sessions, and actually really we were allowing your talk about the update. We really do want to keep the questions and comments to the question box just so we can move forward, but appreciate that. As you can see, we are working with the 2023 date. We are listening to all of the proposals and ideas that people have, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks, Elizabeth. Moving on to the next question from Kevin Messner at AHAM. How do you ban 410A for dehumidifiers when the alternatives under 750 GWP are not legal to use under EPA regulations, and there is practically no time for EPA to approve an acceptable substitute and then allow for redesign and safety testing of products by 2023? This proposal is essentially a ban on dehumidifier sales in California, which are important to indoor air quality and health. For example, a report by California Child Care Health Program administered by UC San Francisco School of Nursing with funding support from the California Department of Education, Child Development Division, and Federal Maternal and Child Health Bureau recommend dehumidifiers in high moisture areas such as basements or when wet cleaning carpeting. Thank you for that comment, Kevin, and I will redirect that to Pamela.
Thanks, Anshul. Thanks, Kevin, for that comment. We understand what you're bringing up, but at the same time, US EPA process, we're encouraged to see that as OEMs have submitted their submissions for new alternatives, such as the ones that just came out under SNAP Rule 23, where EPA is moving forward on approving alternate refrigerants. So our understanding is, I'm not sure what the status is on dehumidifiers, if it's really up to the OEMs to be making the submissions for US EPA to consider. So this is something that EPA is moving forward, and there is still time to get that accomplished. So I'll just leave it at that. I mean, we understand the concern you're raising, but at the same time, this proposal has been discussed for, as somebody else mentioned, for several years. So it's really OEMs have to take that responsibility to look into the alternatives and make those submissions for EPA to consider. So I'll stop there, but thanks for the question and your comment.
Thanks, Pamela. Next, I will read a comment from Gypsy A. Chong at the on behalf of the statewide Appliance Standards Advocacy Team. Thanks to CARB staff for everything they're doing to ensure that California meets its greenhouse gas reduction goals. As CARB indicated in the past, a multi-pronged approach is needed to meet California's GHG emission goals. The approach will include building electrification paired with greening power supply, as well as improving efficiency in existing buildings. HVAC represents 30% of energy used by the commercial sector in the US, 24% of California's GHG emissions from a DOE report and from CARB's CEC EPIC workshop. High-performance heat pumps provide a plug-and-play efficient all-electric HVAC system for new installations, as well as retrofits of existing buildings. The heat pump market is relatively nascent in the US, with less than 0.1% of the global market, with about 15,000 units in California in 2019. And building codes and technologies are not in place to meet the proposed 750 GWP limit. First, R32 VRF systems were installed in Europe in late 2019. Given the promise of heat pumps to meet our electrification and energy efficiency goals in the future, we look forward to working with CARB to identify a path to ensure that California is positioned to benefit from heat pump technology once the technology adapts to lower GWP refrigerants. Thank you for that comment, Gypsy, and we will definitely take that into consideration. Next on, another question from Kevin Messner of AHAM. How do you ban HFC greater than 750 GWP for room ACs that are greater than 25,000 BTUs per hour when the safety standard does not allow enough flammable refrigerant in these larger units? These products represent less than 1% of all room AC shipments, so de minimis impact on the GHG emission goals. Thank you for that comment, Kevin. I will let Catherine respond to that comment. But before you respond, Catherine, I just want to add that it is not just room ACs that would be subject to this regulation. It is all residential as well as commercial ACs, much larger than 25,000 BTUs. And Catherine, do you want to add anything to that?
Thanks, Anshul, and thank you, Kevin, for the comment. I think that is something we're still looking to understand, how the standards, treat these room ACs of that size. And our current understanding is that A2 wells would be allowed for these systems, but that's still something we're taking comment on, and we'll appreciate continued conversations with you after the workshop.
And I just want to add, this is Pamela, regarding the percentage of emissions, I just want to make sure everybody knows that, sure, we obviously want to go after the highest emissions, but even the rules we have adopted in the past, I mean, they cover all end use sectors, like I mentioned before, which may contribute to a very small portion of emissions. But if the technology is feasible, we want them to transition to the lowest possible feasible refrigerant available. So, and that I'll end at that. Thank you.
Next question. Before we take additional questions, I want to add that we will not be taking any verbal comments at this time, simply because we have numerous questions to still respond to and to streamline the process. Next, I will read a comment from Koji Hatano from JRAIA, the Japan Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Industry Association. Based on our experience in Japan preparing for the adoption of low GWP refrigerants, it is of course necessary that codes and standards be modified to accept these refrigerants. What is CARB doing to implement these changes in time for the 2023 adoption? And more specifically, our understanding is that code changes for VRF systems, which have been critical to Japan's efforts to achieve climate goals, will not be able to be modified under any circumstance in time for 2023. I would redirect this question to Mike Fitzgibbon to respond to.
Okay, thanks, Anshul. Well, we're still actively considering the appropriate implementation date for VRF system, and we appreciate all the information that we've received from stakeholders. But as currently written, the VRF systems are going to be included in the 750 GWP limit effective in 2023. And we don't really have any additional updates to mention today on that date.
Thanks, Mike. And I will just add one quick comment to this, is CARB is not a safety standard agency. We merely set GWP limits, and we rely on the expertise of code bodies and building code officials to determine what is safe for use in California. Next, a question from Raghu Kunapali. Is there an active proposal or recommendation to postpone this January 2023 date from industry? What is CARB's position? And I will redirect this question to Elizabeth Shealy to respond to.
Thank you. We appreciate the question. As you have heard, we are people are providing comments and suggestions, and HR Helen just recently spoke about a potential proposal. We are always listening and open to what folks have to say and listening to stakeholders. We are currently using the 2023 date, and that is what we are moving forward with. But we are always open to listening to suggestions.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Next question from Michael Gary at Sheco. Residential AC units with propane R290 are widely adopted in India, are beginning to be manufactured in China, and are expected to be used in Europe. Is R290 a refrigerant that would be acceptable in California, along with the A2L refrigerants, although it is A3, a flammable refrigerant? Thanks for that question, Michael. Like one of us mentioned earlier, we set GWP limits. Right now, current GWP limit is 750. That does not prohibit anyone from using any refrigerant that is much lower than 750. The 750 is just the highest limit. We certainly would like to see a wide variety of refrigerants to be used in California, including A2Ls and A3s. We do understand that A3s are allowed in very small quantities, and we haven't seen units that are able to be designed using the charge limit as it's allowed. We have heard of some very exciting research that's going on to be able to allow A3s, room units, to be used in California with the 150 GWP limit. But certainly we would like to see a diversity of refrigerants in California. Thank you, Michael. Next question from Rainer Jacobs, DKV, Germany. I would like to make a short oral comment based on the experience and perspective from Europe. I will also send you the comment per email. Thank you so much, Rainer. We're not accepting any oral comments at this point to streamline our process, but we would be happy to engage with you via email or set up a meeting after the workshop. Thank you. Next question from Chris Forth at Johnson Controls. Regarding manufacturers' record-keeping requirements on ship-to locations within California, what about equipment entering California indirectly via independent distribution from other states, which manufacturers do not control? And I will redirect this question to Catherine or Glenn to respond to.
Thanks, Anshul. That's a great question. So this record-keeping requirement is fairly standard across all the different end uses that are covered under California's HFC regulation. We understand that manufacturers may distribute their equipment through a distributor, but we believe that manufacturers have a sophisticated enough tracking to understand, keep track of their equipment such that they'd be able to meet this record-keeping requirement. And if there are other challenges associated with that, we recommend reaching out to our team with that comment, but generally this is something that manufacturers have been able to comply with for other types of equipment, and we expect that it is also feasible for AC products as well.
And Catherine, this is Pamela. I'll just add one more thing. So we understand this point that OEMs have raised in the past also, but this reg does subject anybody who sells in California. So as a distributor, if they're selling into California, they should be aware of the regulations, and OEMs, of course, this is the part of post-regulation education outreach, that they make sure that the distributors that are entering into California or selling into California are aware of the California regulations. So OEM record keeping is just to make sure what's being manufactured for sale in California, and a way for us to go back up at a higher level. But anybody besides even OEMs, any distributors or anybody who sells in California would be subject to the regulations. So thanks. But thanks for the question.
Next question from Russ Barnthouse with United Refrigeration. Would HVAC equipment that does not meet the 750 GWP limit be allowed to be warehoused in California for distribution to other areas of the United States? Many products come through ports in California or go through California distribution centers. Now I'll redirect this question to Catherine.
Thank you. So equipment that is simply traveling through California for use in a different state will still be allowed to do so. We understand that, California is a port. There's a lot of equipment moving through California. What we regulate here is really about the equipment that is sold for use here.
This is Shannon. If I could just follow up on that. But please note that if your equipment is found being sold in California, you will be responsible for it. So plan accordingly.
Next question from Chris Walker. Has CARB identified any other compliant refrigerants for use after January 1, 2023, other than A2Ls? If so, have you performed an economic analysis and determined the cost impacts on consumers if A2Ls are not available? And I'll redirect this question to Catherine.
Thank you. It's a great question. So yes, there is an A1 alternative that CARB has considered as a potential compliance option. And CARB has considered an economic analysis that considers a range of different refrigerant options. And this is available on the Department of Finance's website, and it'll also be included in our staff report. So at the time of our 45-day notice package, you'll be able to read through that economic analysis in our staff report as well.
Next question, or rather comment, from Mary Anderson at PG&E. PG&E supports a multi-pronged approach is needed to meet California's GHG emission goals. Based upon our research, PG&E sees the benefits of variable refrigerant flow VRF equipment to meet California's electrification and energy efficiency goals. We encourage CARB to identify a path forward to ensure California is positioned to benefit from VRF technology and allowing sufficient time to adapt to low GWP refrigerants. Thank you for your leadership in moving California to low GWP refrigerants. PG&E supports a multi-pronged approach needed to meet California's GHG goals. Thank you for that comment, Mary. And we certainly do consider a holistic approach to meeting California's statewide goals. Next question from David Calabrese of Daikin. Current safety standards are in the process of revision, but for VRF heat pump systems, there is no viable pathway for code changes to allow for compliance in 2023. As such, a 2023 compliance date applied to VRF will result in banning these systems, which are a critical tool for California's climate goals and are a growing market solution for building owners to achieve greater energy efficiency, zonal heating and cooling, and ease of installation. VRF heat pumps also allow the state to meet its priorities for building electrification. We would urge CARB to provide a pathway for these technologies to be able to be sold in the state while the safety standards are revised. Thank you for that comment, David. We will definitely consider your comments. Pamela or Catherine, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Thanks, Anshul. I think, Mike covered this before, that we're still actively considering the appropriate implementation date for VRF systems. We really do appreciate the stakeholders who have reached out to us. We understand that the standards that would be placed on VRF systems to allow A2Ls are very stringent with their requirements for sensors and restrictions on charge sizes. We are working with our partners at the CEC to understand the energy efficiency benefits of this technology. Obviously here at CARB, where we're a climate change focused agency, energy efficiency is very important to us. That said, we understand that VRFs do have a very large charge size with refrigerants. So Our HFC team is doing our due diligence to understand those emissions as well, and how that folds into our SB 1383 target. And I would just, encourage you to continue your discussions with us. You'll see that currently written, the VRF systems are included. And, we really don't have any other updates at this time about the VRF systems, except we encourage you to continue engaging with us. It's an important topic, energy efficiency and refrigerant emissions. So, yeah, just, thank you for your comment and writing in about this.
Thanks, Catherine. Next question from Ruben Kurhilva. Is there a contract in place to conduct safety testing the fire service is interested in? Will the testing be based on the worst case probable case? Will the outcome of the testing be made publicly available regardless of the outcome? Thanks for that question, Ruben. Whatever studies CARB conducts, we make all the results publicly available. We have provided support for A3 testing, in the past, and the report is available from HRTI. It's publicly available. We currently do not have any additional contracts in place to look at the safety testing that the fire service is interested in. However, we are aware that UL and AHRI are conducting the necessary fire testing, safety testing that the fire service is interested in. And we certainly support that the outcomes be made publicly available. Next question from Phil Hombrecht. Why are dehumidifiers included in this HFC ban, as there is no EPA authorized alternative A2L refrigerant available for use? Is CARB working with EPA to change the available substitutes in current SNAP rules? If so, do you have a time as to when this approval is likely to be allowed? This is very important for manufacturers to have clarity in this regard. I appreciate the feedback. Thanks for that question, Phil. I think Pamela already answered a similar question from Kevin Messner at AHAM. As far as working with EPA to change the available substitutes in the current SNAP rules, that is not something that CARB does. As our understanding is that equipment manufacturers work with the EPA, submit applications to allow for different refrigerant use for their equipment types. Next question from John Cummings, Senior Applications Engineer at LG Electronics. Commercial air conditioning. With an upcoming restriction of refrigerants having GWP above 750, it will be difficult to develop new HVAC products with new refrigerant A2L meeting DOE minimum efficiency requirements, training HVAC technicians to safely handle A2L refrigerants, and finally to qualify equipment for OSHPD requirements. The process for OSHPD, which included shake table testing and operability testing, normally takes slightly more than 1 year. With that in mind, LG would recommend to California customers to have a postponement of the January 1st, 2023 effective date to January 1st, 2025. Do you agree to change that to prevent building project delays in California hospitals, large and small, fire and police stations with Category 4 critical importance? Many OSHPD hospital takes years to design, plan, and build in accordance with these requirements. Thank you for that comment, John, and I will redirect that to Catherine.
And I'll jump in and also let Catherine respond as well, but I just wanted to convey that what we've heard earlier, which is that we have been working with stakeholders for many years on these and have been working through the issues that you consider. And so we've been working since 2016 on this regulatory process with this, with these restrictions in mind. If there are specific issues related to OSHPD requirements that we need to consider, we would be happy to follow up with you and learn more about what those specific considerations or criteria are. I don't know, Catherine, if you had anything you wanted to add on that.
Thank you. We do understand the planning and effort it takes with, permitting and project design, especially for, hospitals and, other buildings like that. Part of why 2023 was selected as the date was to align with the DOE. I know, John, you mentioned the new DOE minimum efficiency requirements, and we understand it's quite a bit of work to redesign for those. It's a major undertaking. At the same time, there's a benefit of aligning with that cycle, as it you can leverage the work that's being done there to fold in this new change with the refrigerant, which is a relatively smaller part of the redesign. We know that A2L refrigerants in particular are more energy efficient, so it can help meet the DOE requirements. We're certainly always interested in hearing about all the different steps along the way that it takes for a manufacturer to go from the R&D phase all the way to commercializing a product. And we're still taking comment on the appropriate implementation date, but we also do have our legislative mandate, which requires everybody to step up and, work on help us meet these goals on a, quick implementation schedule. So, this decade, 2020 to 2030, is really an imperative time for acting on climate change. It's a key window. Otherwise there'll be some pretty challenging, consequences in the future for Californians. So to meet this mandate, we've really identified that it's essential for the AC industry to transition as soon as possible. And we understand there are some challenges and barriers, but we're really looking to design this regulation to give the industry its best chance of, working through these barriers and getting there together. So we know each year of delay has a significant impact on emissions reductions. Part of this is just because the sheer volume of equipment sales that come to California, and that when you sell a piece of equipment, the lifetime, the refrigerant use is locked in for its lifetime. But that said, we certainly appreciate hearing about these specific challenges so we can take them into account.
Thanks, Catherine. Before I read the next question, I've received additional messages from some of the people who asked questions about their affiliation, so I will just read those out. Ruben Grahilva is from firechiefs.com LLC, consultant to Honeywell. Phil Hombrick is a representing Media America Corporation. Next comment from Alex Hilbrand at the Natural Resources Defense Council. We are encouraged by recent progress to open California's market to lower GWP refrigerants, both at EPA SNAP and through the State Fire Marshal's Office. We support CARB finalizing this important regulation with a 2023 effective date. Thank you for that comment, Alex. Next question from Alan Karpman. Will CARB take into account the charge size of a unit, i.e. an AC with a slightly higher GWP and a smaller charge may have less impact than lower GWP and higher charge? And I'll direct this question to Catherine or Glenn to respond to.
Thank you, Alan. So, as I mentioned on the slide that showed some of the different refrigerant options out there, there are trade-offs with each refrigerant type. For some refrigerants, it is possible to achieve a smaller charge size. And with some equipment designs, it's also possible to achieve smaller charge sizes. We are not specifying a specific technology or a specific refrigerant. That's one reason why we're setting a bar at the GWP limit. But this is an interesting point that there could be additional benefits associated with charge size reduction. So that's something we're aware of, and we look at in our inventory. And but we're setting a specific bar with a GWP refrigerant to provide a range of options.
Thanks. Next, I will read a comment from Christina Starr at the Environmental Investigation Agency. EIA is greatly concerned by industry requests to delay the start date of a 750 GWP ban or exempt certain equipment. As other stakeholders have noted and CARB outlined, this has been proposed for many years. Any delay would only make it harder to meet the 2030 emission goals, which currently proposed measures are already insufficient to meet. Any change to this date must be accompanied by a proposal from equipment manufacturers to offset those emissions and provide additional direct HFC emission reductions compared with the current proposal. EIA has formulated a proposal for manufacturers to directly offset any additional emissions by using reclaimed refrigerant to offset the full life cycle of any exempted equipment, and would be happy to further discuss this option with CARB and other stakeholders. Thank you for that comment, Christina. Another comment from Rainer Jacobs
Hey,
at the German. Yes.
Can you know, this is Mike. Hey, I just wanted to thank Christine for that comment, and we've been working closely with her over the years, and I just want to reiterate, every time that we hear from somebody that they want to delay, we've been making the same request of them, is that we need to be made whole for our 2030 target. So the idea of using reclaim in, by the OEMs is probably a good idea they should be looking into. But again, any requests for delays, we need something else to make up for those differences, just like the supermarkets did. They took a really novel approach, had several compliance pathways that they figured out to meet our goals. And so we're hopeful that the AC folks will be able to do the same thing. Thanks, Anshel.
Thanks for adding that, Mike. Next question from Allison Skid at Remanufacturing. With respect to the obvious benefits of aligning with the national transition for air conditioning, are you considering any viable scenarios where alternative emission reduction measures, such as use of reclaimed refrigerant for service, can offset a potentially later implementation date for AC? Thanks, Allison. And since Mike just responded to a very similar comment, yes, we highly encourage alternative proposals that offset the emission reductions. Next question. This is from Jay Peters at Codes and Standards International. If the California State Fire Marshal concludes that it is not prudent to move forward with code changes to regulate A2L refrigerants in direct high probability HVAC systems, how could CARB still move forward with the 2023 deadline without any mechanism in place to protect the public, provide safe guidance to installers, or regulate these flammable refrigeration systems? In essence, if they are installed, they would be considered illegal.
And I can respond to that. This is Elizabeth, and if anybody else wants to add to it. As folks have stated before, we are not requiring any one alternative. There is a limit on the GWP, which could be met by different alternatives. As Catherine mentioned earlier, there is an A1 potential alternative on being considered as well. We are continuing to follow the state fire marshal process, and that will be concluded by the time we will understand a lot more by the time of our board hearing on that process.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Next question by John Gibbons, Carrier. Is there still opportunity for CARB reconsideration given the recession, COVID impact on OEMs, codes and standards, and overall impact on consumers in California? Elizabeth or Shannon, would you like to respond to that?
This is Elizabeth. I can start out on that, and if anybody else wants to weigh in. As we've talked about earlier, we have been talking about this for quite a while, and industry did come together previously with an agreement on this date. And so we have been working on moving it way before any of the recent events. We are always open to listening to ideas and to suggestions and proposals that allow us to still get to our goal.
And this is Glenn Gallagher from CARB. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'd just like to point out that the 750 GWP limit for air conditioning has been proposed by CARB in several documents dating back to 2016 and 2017 in the short-lived climate pollutant plan. So as Elizabeth pointed out, this should not come as news that we have been proposing this for some time.
Thanks, Glenn and Elizabeth. Next, a comment from Helen Walter Ternoni, a continuation of her comment earlier. I wanted to let you know that we have been doing some work to summarize leak rates through testing and summarizing your data, which we would be happy to share with you as this is an important component of the assessment of emissions for future. We appreciate CARB's continued willingness to discuss issues with stakeholders related to both commercial refrigeration and air conditioning, and we look forward to continued discussions in the coming weeks and continuing to work together to meet California's SLCP goals. Thank you for that comment, Helen.
Yeah, and this is Mike. I just would like to acknowledge the hard work that Helen's put into making things happen over the past few years. So we really appreciate what you've done, and we appreciate working with you moving forward.
Next, we have a question by Christopher Booch from the National Energy Management Institute. A 2008 California Energy Commission report found that 90% of the California residential HVAC replacements were completed without a permit. A decade later, the CPUC estimates that new permits are obtained for less than 8% of residential HVAC replacements. Will equipment sales be tracked to the end user to ensure all installations are held to the same requirements? Thanks for that comment, Christopher. We are aware of the non-compliance for permit pulling in California. CEC, the California Energy Commission, has been doing work on SB 1414 to increase non-compliance, or sorry, to increase compliance with permit pulling. And we're also hopeful that with this transition to A2Ls, the work that the Safe Refrigerant Task Force that AHRI is leading will lead to more training and communication programs by industry to address some of these concerns around untrained technicians. Next question by Nanette Lockwood from Train Technologies. COVID-19 has made the alignment with the DOE redesign work next to impossible for many manufacturers. Are you taking this into consideration? Thank you. Elizabeth, since you responded to a similar question, would you like to add anything else to this question by Nanette?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I would just reiterate what I said before, but please come to us with any ideas, proposals, or suggestions, or any hardships. We are moving forward with the 2023 date, as we've been talking about, and as we need to meet our long-term goals. But as stated before, we're always open to listening to options that are brought to us.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Next question by Jeff Whitelaw at Mitsubishi. CARB has mentioned that part of 2023 date is to align with DOE changes, and the refrigerant transition is a similar change. The efficiency changes generally do not require new compressors, addition of sensors, etc. So refrigerant changes are significantly more involved change and require several years of redesign and testing. Also, it has been mentioned that CARB has been discussing this change for several years, but without fixed requirements, testing requirements, and updated building codes, manufacturers cannot proceed with design. We need certainty so we can design accordingly. Pamela, would you like to respond to this question?
Sure. I think I'm going to reiterate what's been said before, and I don't want to sound redundant, but the reality, like you said in this question, this has been put out for several years, and I would specifically want to mention that the 2023 data, as was pointed out earlier, came from equipment manufacturers in order to align with DOE transitions so that OEMs don't have to do multiple transitions or multiple designs, I should say. So we understand the certainty part. In fact, that's one reason we have been sticking with the date so that equipment manufacturers have that certainty. And as far as the whole code and standard process, I think industry has done a great job in adopting the UL and ASHRAE standards, but these standards continue to get updated. This is a process that's being worked in parallel. And again, it goes back to the equipment manufacturers who are very much engaged in those codes and standard committees and have been doing the testing. So again, this is nothing new. This has been going on for several years. The dates came out from OEMs to align with DOE. A lot of testing has been done. So our goal and our, I guess, that's what we're trying to do here, is to provide certainty by sticking to the effective date that we have proposed right now. But like Elizabeth said earlier, we are always open and want to hear if there are any specific issues or concerns. But thanks for the question and comment.
Thanks, Pamela. Next, a comment from Rainer Jacobs at the German Society of Refrigeration and Air Conditioning. To my opinion, there is no need to have GWP limits on so many products, especially not high efficiency heat pumps. In Europe, the phase down is working very well without putting much restriction on the GWP of the refrigerant. We took the approach to keep the freedom of choice as much as possible in order to avoid any negative impact to energy efficiency and safety. In 3 years, between 2015 and 2018, a reduction of 37% was achieved, and after 6 years, 2021, 55% will be achieved. The driver was and is the quota for the total quantity placed on the market. Innovation resulted in a reduced consumption of high GWP refrigerants and accelerated the recovery and reclaim of refrigerant. When needed, the GWP limit of 750 is a good limit and globally accepted, but there must also be the time for change. The GWP 750 limit in Europe was announced 10 years before it took action. GWP is lower than 750, limit the choice and innovation opportunities too much. Thank you for that comment, Rainer. Next question by Peter Williams. How does CARB reconcile the continued decline of reclaim as an option to meet the 2030 mandate? Glenn, would you like to answer that?
Yes, thank you for the question. The continuing decline of reclaim refrigerant is a huge concern to CARB and anybody interested in greenhouse gas emissions. As I indicated earlier, we have been looking into this issue since at least for 15 years, if not longer. and it remains a challenge. We believe that with some of the options going forward, if we can incentivize the use of reclaim in new refrigeration equipment or in servicing, that would do quite a bit. We're also hopeful that there may be a national HFC phase down in production, and that will certainly lead to more reclaim as the high global warming potential refrigerants become more and more scarce. And if CARB staff would like to elaborate, please do so. No.
Thanks, Glenn. Next question by Mikhail Squarla from Carrier. Is there a contingency if codes are not adopted by the State Fire Marshal, specifically with regard to HVAC by 2023? Mike, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Sorry, I was on mute, and Elizabeth can certainly back me up on this one. But I think that's been the plan all along. We've been working closely with the OEMs and AHRI, trying to come up if there are other options to meet our targets. If the State Fire Marshal process and codes aren't ready by 2023, I think we're all hopeful initially that the codes were going to be in place, but there was a lot of politics that was happening on the committees and all that stuff. So that's why this delay is happening. So if the 2023 codes are not in place, then we're going to have to come up with some other serious ways to get to our 2030 targets. Elizabeth, do you have anything further?
I think that was good. I think we are following the process, and we will know a lot more as we get closer to the board hearing date. We are hopeful that the process continues, that folks continue to work through it and really give it its full due, and that we have a good recommendation coming out that has received full support from folks in all of the testing, whether it is done or not, that people have really made an effort to move forward on that process. But we will continue to follow it and work with the State Fire Marshal.
Thanks, Elizabeth and Mike. Next question by Karen Myers from Ream. Can CARB explain how they are evaluating the new option presented to CARB by industry? Catherine or Pamela, would you like to respond to that?
All I'll say, this is Pamela, I'll just say that this proposal just came to us very recently, and something we've asked AHRI to provide more information. So I would not comment on it at this point because we're still trying to understand and have already asked some questions for AHRI to provide.
Thanks, Pamela. Next question by Dave Cuccio. Sorry, I just need a minute to find the question. Okay, the market size for R410A is estimated to be around 58 million pounds per year. Considering the life cycle of a unit could be 9 years, this means that the installed amount of 410A is somewhere around 522 million pounds. Currently, the economic value of R410A is so low that it cannot be recycled economically, and this will be a growing liability. What is the plan for California to force recycling of this product? Glenn or Catherine, would you like to respond to that?
This is Glenn. I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but CARB is looking into many, many different options on how to increase the recycling. We are aware right now that new refrigerant is less expensive than recycled refrigerant. And that is a real problem when it comes to incentivizing any technician to recover that refrigerant for reuse. Catherine?
Yeah, Glenn, I think you're covering this questions about reclaim. Captures, the activities going on at CARB. And, I'd also just add that part of this proposal is to turn off the tap on, virgin R410A coming in. It's kind of a first step, is to just cut off the new supply of this high GWP refrigerant. That's a crucial first step as CARB sees it.
Yeah, and this is Mike, if I could just add to that, I think the OEMs have a really a good role they can play in making this happen by using it in pre-charged equipment, et cetera. And then also, at a future date, maybe servicing, which will pose a very big enforcement challenge for ARB, going from just X number of OEMs to thousands of service providers for enforcement would be a very big challenge. But I think there's opportunities for the OEMs to get involved in the reclaim effort.
Thanks, Catherine and Mike and Glenn. That brings us to the end of the AC portion of today's presentation. We still have a few questions that we will address after the next presentation, if time allows. If not, we will respond to your questions via email after today's workshop. Thank you, and on to Elizabeth Brega for the variance portion of the presentation.
Thank you, Anshul. Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Brega. I'm also part of the F-gas reduction strategy section within CARB's research division. Thank you all again for joining us. Today, I'm going to be presenting on some of the other proposed updates to the regulation. I'm also going to be discussing an additional variance provision that we have added to the proposed regulation. All right, so to give you an update on where we are in the agenda, we heard from Richie and Catherine this morning, presenting earlier today on the refrigeration and AC portions. So now we're going to move into the last portion of the workshop before we move to concluding remarks. And as Anshul mentioned, try and get to some more questions that we have to cover still. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm going to touch on some of the main regulatory updates, as well as give an overview of the variance provisions that we have added. I'm going to be discussing just a general overview of the variance criteria, the application process itself, and some of the key application materials. Okay, so to give a brief overview of the proposed regulatory updates, you'll see throughout the regulatory text that there are several additions, amendments, and updates that we have made. We highly encourage everybody to go back and refer to the regulatory text. It is posted on our website. Please review it and provide comments or any questions that you might have to us, and we will provide the email address to do so at the end of the presentation. To touch on one of the major updates that you will see within the regulatory text, it's within the definitions section. In addition to several of the AC and refrigeration definitions that we've added to the regulatory text, we wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we've updated, amended, and added several definitions related to the SB 1013 end uses. In particular, we've added several definitions relating to foam end uses, and this is really in order to provide more clarity around this end use. We've also added a definition for bear spray, propellant, and metered dose inhaler. For the foam end uses in particular, we consulted with industry experts to derive the foam definitions. And we've also been working with other U.S. Climate Alliance states to align our definitions as much as possible. All right, to move to the proposed variance provisions, CARB has created a variance procedure, and this is in order to address very specific situations in which end users cannot comply with the regulatory requirements. And I'm going to get into that now. All right, so there are two types of variances that somebody can apply for. The first is an impossibility variance, and the second is a force majeure variance. I'm going to discuss what each of these variances mean, and specifically the criteria that must be met in order to apply for each one. All right, so as I mentioned, the first variance is the impossibility variance. If you look at the definitions in the regulatory text, you'll see that impossibility means that the applicant exercised extraordinary care, but still was unable to comply with the regulatory requirements for reasons beyond their control, despite exercising foresight to prevent the non-compliance. To apply for the impossibility variance, there are 4 criteria that must be met. First, the applicant must be able to demonstrate that a lower risk substitute is not currently available or potentially available. Second, that the variance will not increase overall risk to human health or the environment. Third, that the applicant has a niche end use or circumstance. And fourth, that the applicant used best efforts to anticipate and address the impossibility and any potential non-compliance. The second type of variance is a force majeure variance. The definition of force majeure is pretty lengthy. I'm not going to read it word for word, so I encourage everybody to go back to the regulatory text in the definition section to review it themselves. Essentially what it means, though, is that there is some sort of unforeseeable event, for example, a fire, a war, or a pandemic, which makes compliance with the regulation not possible. In order to apply for the force majeure variance, there are 2 criteria that must be met. First, the applicant must be able to demonstrate that non-compliance is due to a force majeure event. And second, that the applicant used best efforts to anticipate and address the force majeure and any potential non-compliance. All right, the application process itself is pretty straightforward. I'm going to walk us through it now. So the first step is that the applicant will submit the application to CARB, and this will be done primarily through email. Then an executive officer will have 30 days to review the application for completeness, and at this time request more information if needed. A 30-day public comment period will then commence. Following the public comment period, the executive officer will have up to 60 days to review the application materials and the public comments. And if they approve the variance, an executive order will then be issued. There is one exception to this process, and that is in the case of a force majeure application. If an applicant submits a variance application for a force majeure event, the executive officer has the discretion to approve the variance immediately, but it must be to protect human health or the environment. In this situation, the applicant or the application will still go through the same 30-day public comment period, and following the public comment period, the executive officer may modify or revoke the executive order at their discretion. All right, some general points about the variance language. First, the variance is only approved for the applicant, and it is not a blanket variance for the entire industry. Second, the variance cannot be retroactively applied. What this means is that the variance is only approved from the time after the variance is granted and not before. So if an applicant chooses to apply for a variance after any date of prohibition has already gone into effect, the applicant may be liable for any non-compliance from the time period following the effective date of prohibition to the issuance date of the variance. And finally, at any time, a variance may be modified or revoked if it is found that any terms or conditions specified in the executive order have not been followed, or if the applicant no longer meets the criteria for impossibility or force majeure that I previously discussed. Okay, there are several application materials that must be submitted. I'm only going to go through the key application materials, but there are others, so I encourage everybody to go back to the regulatory text and review all of the application materials. One of the first things that must be provided is the applicant must provide evidence, rationale, and supporting documentation relating to the impossibility or force majeure variance they're applying for, and specifically how they meet those criteria of the variance that I was discussing earlier. The applicant must also submit a compliance plan, and it must describe in detail how if a variance is granted, compliance will be achieved as expeditiously as possible. And it must also include the method by which compliance will be achieved, milestone dates, and milestone achievements. They must also submit a description of the damage or harm that would result from the compliance with the regulatory requirements. And this means we're looking for information regarding adverse effects pertaining to things such as closure of a facility, economic harm, loss of profit. Those are just examples. If an applicant is applying for an impossibility variance, we would like a quantification of current greenhouse gas emissions resulting from normal business as usual operations. This will include quantification of direct greenhouse gas emissions and also indirect greenhouse gas emissions. All calculations have to be based on the average lifetime of the equipment or product that will continue to use the prohibited substance. The applicant must also submit information regarding any negative impacts to human health or the environment. And finally, the applicant must also submit a mitigation plan that demonstrates how they will reduce excess greenhouse gas emissions to a level equal to or below what would have been admitted had the applicant been in compliance, and also how the applicant will mitigate any negative impacts to human health or the environment. All right, next steps. Richie and Catherine already covered this earlier, but to highlight it once again, we are in July 2020 and having our last workshop. The 45-day notice package, which includes the regulatory text and staff report, will be released in October, and that will kick off the formal 45-day public comment period leading up to the board hearing in December. Please provide any comments and feedback regarding the regulatory text to HFC reductions at arb.ca.gov by August 5th. And this is to be considered ahead of the final 45-day notice package. All right, we will now take questions. Please note at this time, we will not be answering specific individual or hypothetical questions regarding to the variance, but we do want to hear your questions. We're taking feedback and are able to speak to you offline. I'm going to be answering questions, and I'm also joined with Shannon Dilley of our legal office and my colleagues Pamela Gupta and Glenn Gallagher.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I will read out the first question we've received from Jennifer Rowe with the California Automatic Vendors Council. When does variance end for equipment that isn't available?
I'm sorry, Anshul, can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I understood.
Yes. When does variance end for equipment that isn't available?
This is Shannon. I can take that question if you like. You know, the deadlines for once a variance is granted, it will specify the deadline in the variance, and you know, this will be very fact specific to each company, and so we can't give a deadline right now, just because it'll depend on the information, the supporting documents, the evidence that is submitted to us. So the answer is it depends.
Thanks, Shannon. Next question from Ronald Shebeck of Husband Corporation, or actually Paul Griffin from Panasonic. Will it be possible to employ the variance process in the near future, or will it only be available after the board hearing in December?
Shannon, feel free to add to this, but this will go into effect when the regulation itself goes into effect. So it would be following the board hearing.
It would be, yes. And just to follow up, we have a process that we go through. Once the board hearing is over, we submit it to the Office of Administrative Law, and once they've approved it, it becomes law. So not before.
And just a follow-up comment by the same person. There's a residential compact refrigeration deadline coming up very soon, January 2021, for the variance process.
If you have any other comments or recommendations for us, Paul, on how to best move forward, we would love to hear them. Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we're not going to comment during this workshop on individual situations or provide any sort of legal advice regarding with compliance with current regulations. Everyone has to comply with the current regulations. So please meet with your legal counsel on that.
And Shannon, this is Pamela. I just wanted to chime in. The other part, I want to make sure the intent of this variance is clear, that the intent is really to go after any niche end use or circumstance and not necessarily apply as a blanket exemption or delay for a particular industry. So I guess I'm reacting to the last part, which says residential compact refrigeration deadline. So this variance is really for on a case-by-case basis for any user who's having these issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Pamela. Next question by Nicholas Georges with the Household and Commercial Products Association, HCPA. HCPA would like to thank CARB staff for conducting today's webinar and soliciting stakeholder questions. I would like to ask if staff has considered harmonizing the definition of aerosol propellant with already existing CARB regulations, specifically the Consumer Products Regulation.
Glenn, would you like to answer that?
This is Glenn. The answer is yes. CARB is doing our best to harmonize all definitions and all regulations with pre-existing regulations, for example, aerosol propellants and our consumer products regulations. So the answer is yes. We are in the process of harmonizing all of that. And if you could send us an example of what you mean, that would be great.
Thanks, Glenn. And that brings us to the end of the questions for the variance language. You have one last opportunity to submit any questions on this portion of today's presentation before we bring today's presentation to a close.
Are we ready to end things, Anchal?
I think so, yeah. There's no more questions on the variance language. So if you would like to close today's webinar.
Well, again, I'd like to thank everyone for participating. This is Mike Fitzgibbon. I'm a branch manager in the research division. And this was our first, virtual workshop webinar since the stay-at-home order. So we appreciate you putting up with us learning how to do this. I'd like to thank the CARB presenters, Richie, Catherine, and Liz, for their great presentations on the refrigeration, air conditioning, and variance provisions. And then the rest of the CARB team for handling questions and moving this regulation forward. I'd like to say we will follow up on any unanswered questions that we didn't get to in the refrigeration and air conditioning sections. And again, I want to remind you, I don't know if somebody can flip the slide back just to the deadlines there, but we'd like to receive comments and feedback regarding what we discussed today by August 5th, so we can include it in our final 45-day notice package, and that will be coming out on October 23rd. And 45 days later, we'll have our board meeting December 10th or 11th, 2020. So again, thanks to everybody for participating. Thanks to everyone we've been working with over the past several years on these very important regulations to help climate change. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. And we will end the webinar now.